It's time to do the roof raise. Now, I'll admit, I have may gone a little bit overboard with that opening, but I just couldn't resist. Anyways, if you're new here, hi, my name is Cinnamon Roll, and I'm building a school bus into my home. If you're a returning viewer, welcome back. In last week's video, I started preparing for the roof raise, specifically by extending certain sections of the wiring and by removing any unneeded wiring from the loom. Before I could continue with that, however, I needed to do a little bit of cleanup. I made sure to zip tie any wires that were loose so they were nice, neat, and clean. In some places I had to make repairs, or because I was removing stuff I had to cut everything apart and solder it back together again. I decided that I wanted to keep this heater core here so that I could have window defrost, so I had to screw it back into place. So when I originally removed the support structure for this area, I had to cut these wires that powered the fan for this heater core. Because I'm going to use them again, I had to repair them. And here's a little trick that I learned from Jake the Garden Snake. If you have any open wires that need to be sealed, you slide one half of a section of heat shrink tubing over the wire, folding it halfway. Then you take another section of heat shrink and slide it over the top. Apply heat, and you end up with a nice sealed end of a wire. These particular wires I'm going to zip tie out of the way for now. I then continued to clean up the wiring harness, removing what isn't needed and repairing what needs repairing. So in multiple places there were these wires that ran over the ceiling of the bus. I temporarily taped them into place and added extra length to account for the roof raise. It's amazing how much extra stuff they put into these wiring harnesses. I think what Bluebird did was have a standard wiring harness for all their buses and then only connect what was needed. Once that was done, I had to clean up the mess I just made. And this was all of the wiring that I removed. So you may remember from a few weeks ago that I had painted this floor black. Well, it was while I was sweeping up that I noticed something. The paint that I'd applied was starting to wear away and rust was starting to show. Now I did end up fixing this, but that will be in a later video. So again, everything that I did at this point in the video was in preparation for the roof raise. So there was still a lot of material that I had to remove. There was also this cover over the bifolding door mechanism that turned out to be a bit of a challenge to take off. There were these strips of metal around the door frame, and I needed access to the cavities in behind because eventually my plan was to fill them with insulation. To get them off, I had to remove the window, which was surprisingly easy to do. I pulled 5 screws out, and by prying with a crowbar and yanking with my hands, the window came out with little to no fanfare. So my plan was for the door frame to remain in place while the roof around it raised with the rest of the body. In order to do that, I had to figure out what was staying and what was moving. At this point, I was just basically removing stuff to see how everything went together. I was trying to formulate a plan around where I needed to cut or pop rivets. I realized that one of the marker lights had wires running through this hat channel. Now, to do the roof raise, I needed to cut through this hat channel, but I didn't want to cut the wires that were in it, so I drilled a hole to pull the wires through. So it was right about here where I made a really dumb mistake. Have you ever seen what happens when a grinder throws sparks onto a glass surface? Yeah, that's what I did to my camera lens. Thankfully it still worked, but the image was a little blurry, so I temporarily switched over to my cheaper cameras. I then worked above the driver's side window. It was basically the same story where I had to remove whatever structure was in the way of the roof raise. I had to cut and bend these pieces of metal up to make room to get my grinder in there. You're probably asking why I didn't just use a socket and wrench to take the bolts out. Well, it's because the nuts on the bolts were welded into place. Thanks, Bluebird. Now, because of the height that I was raising the roof by, I decided to do a sloped front. That means that the front section will remain in place, but the metal behind it was going to go up. So, these pieces of metal here had to go. The driver's side window was pretty much only held in with a single screw at this point, so I made the decision to go ahead and remove it temporarily just to give myself some wiggle room. So as I mentioned earlier, the front section of the bus is remaining in place while the metal behind it is going up, so I had to make a cut in the metal behind this front hat channel. I marked out with a square and a Sharpie where to cut, and then used the Sawzall to make quick work of it. Now, if you've watched my videos up until now, you'd know that up until this point in this series, I have removed a lot of rivets. Well, that is nothing compared to what I had to do here. I estimate that I probably removed about 400 to 700 rivets over the course of this video. Doing this took me, I think, something like 3 days to get all these rivets out. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, I'd be very appreciative if you'd consider subscribing. It's by no means necessary, but it does help this channel grow. So if you feel so inclined, I'd be very grateful. So at first I was just using the air chisel to remove the rivets, but I eventually found out that if I cut the rivets with the grinder first, it made my job much easier. So once I'd gotten all the rivets out that I thought I needed to get out, I needed to come up with a solution for how I was going to do the actual lifting of the roof. I screwed together these 2x4s so that they would span the distance between the bottle jacks and the hat channels on the ceiling. I also bought 2 6-foot lengths of 1/2-inch threaded rod. I would be using these as the stabilizers. The threaded rod slid through the inside of these pipes, but I only bought 3, so I had to cut them in half so that I would have a total of 6. I took the 2 6-foot lengths of threaded rod and cut them down to 6 2-foot lengths. I cleaned up the edges of the pipes on the bench grinder. And then I ground down the edges of the threaded rod. I then cleaned up the ends so that the nuts would thread on. What I was doing here was getting ready to cut the hat channels. To do that, I needed to make some extra room, so I removed the windows around each one. So at this point, I wasn't cutting all the hat channels, just the ones where I needed to put the threaded rod supports. I know this might seem a bit confusing at this point, but once you see the system in action, it will make a lot more sense. I welded the pipe below the cut so that the threaded rod would slide through the pipe. I then welded the threaded rod to a bracket that was welded above the cut. This way the nut would sit on top of the pipe, but the threaded rod would be unable to turn. This is what I would use to keep the roof level as I was lifting with the bottle jacks. I temporarily put the windows back in again because there was a pretty good chance of rain that night, and then rinse and repeat 5 more times. And this is what the final assembly looked like. Finally, it was time to do what I've been looking forward to for months. It was roof raise day. For this, I had some help, so everyone say a big welcome to my older brother. I would not have been able to do this in one day without him. So I was showing him here how easy these windows were to remove, and this is the reason why I don't keep these. Bus windows are notoriously bad insulators, and they leak like a sieve. They can actually make for a hazardous situation if water is able to leak in behind your wells, and you could end up with mold. It's one of the reasons why I cringe every time I see a bus build where they kept the bus windows. Not to say that it doesn't work, but it's a risk that I wasn't willing to take. I marked the hat channels with tape, and my brother made most of the cuts. I made sure to stagger all the cuts so that they weren't all on the same plane. The reason I did this was for strength. It's kinda like Lego, where the weakest joint is a straight one. You want to stagger your joints so that the point of failure is less likely to be where the cuts were. I started at the front and began to lift the roof by about 2 inches or so. Then we went around and tightened all the nuts on the threaded rod, making sure to measure that we were still level as we went. In this way, we alternated between lifting the front and back, leveling as needed. During the lifting process, we discovered that the threaded rod wasn't really strong enough to keep the roof from flexing and moving, so we needed to find another solution. After some brainstorming, what we decided to do was grab some 2x4s and screwed them to the outside of the hat channels. This kept everything aligned as we lifted, and it also prevented the whole roof from falling over on top of us. We also used this trick to keep the hat channel filler pieces aligned as we welded them in place. We were running out of time, so we decided to weld in just enough spacer pieces to keep the roof from falling down overnight. Now, I did come back and weld in the rest of the filler pieces, but you'll see that in the next video. Because there were no windows anymore, everything was open to the elements, which meant that I had to take everything that couldn't get wet out of the bus. So for now, I'll end this video with a cleaning montage. Thank you so much for watching, enjoy your day, and I'll see you in the next one.